All right. Well, good afternoon, or at least it's afternoon here when I'm recording this. I hope everyone's well. So, yeah, I guess you know that the course has moved online. Um, so here's what we're going to try, at least for this week. We'll see how it works. I'm going to post some slideshows that are narrated, right? These are based on my lecture notes. It's not exactly the same experience you'd get in the classroom, but this is what we're going to have to try, right? So anyway, um, this week you can expect 3 videos. This is the first one. And this one is on the Barber Paradox. So why are we talking about this? Well, hopefully it'll become clearer as we get into the second and third videos. But here's sort of a sneak peek, right? What we're going to try to be doing here is looking at a particular form of an argument, right, called a reductio ad absurdum argument. And the idea here, right, is that we start with some sort of assumption, right, and we show that an absurdity or a contradiction follows from it, right? And then we'll see what we're supposed to do in this sort of case. Right, so we're going to start with a short story called The Barber Paradox. All right, so excuse me. The Barber Paradox comes from Bertrand Russell. Right, so we read him in the very beginning of the course. This was the Value of Philosophy guy. Here's a picture of him. He lived to be really old. This is presumably a picture when he's quite old. But anyway, he gives this paradox, right? This argument or this sort of story, right, that has an absurd conclusion, right, to show something, right? And historically, right, this was supposed to show something about the foundations of arithmetic, right? That's interesting. We can talk about it in the discussion board if people want to. But I'm going to set that aside, and we're just going to get to the story. So here's a short story, right? It's not very entertaining or well written, but here's the story all the same. So in a certain town, there's a barber who shaves all and only those who do not shave themselves. That is, any person who doesn't shave their own face is shaved by the barber, and no one else is shaved by the barber. Okay, so right, so if I live in this town or village or whatever, right, and I don't shave my own face, then my face is shaved by the barber, right? And the same for all of you, right? And note that the barber doesn't shave anyone else, right? All and only those people who don't shave their own face. Okay, so we're going to take a reading comprehension quiz, right? So I'm going to ask some questions about the case, and I want you to sort of think through them. Okay, so suppose that we have this guy, McX, and McX doesn't shave himself, right? Here's the question, reading comprehension, does the barber shave him? Okay, so take a second to think about this. You can look back at the text if you want to, but it shouldn't be a difficult question. And the answer is yes, right? The barber shaves McX because McX doesn't shave himself, right? So look back at the story, right? The barber shaves all and only those who do not shave themselves. We're told that McX doesn't shave himself, so the barber shaves him. Right? Any person who doesn't shave their own face is shaved by the barber. Well, McX doesn't shave his own face, right? So the barber shaves him. Okay, so easy question to start with. Let's see sort of what happens next. Let's suppose instead that McX does shave himself. Well, does the barber shave him? Again, look back at the text, think through this, give it a second. The answer is no, right? The barber shaves only those people who don't shave themselves, right? McX shaves himself, so the barber doesn't shave him. Okay, so in the classroom at this point, I'd ask, like, is everyone clear about this? I hope everyone's clear about this. It's fairly straightforward, I think. If someone shaves himself, right, the barber doesn't shave him, right? And if someone doesn't shave himself, the barber does shave him. Okay, so we're good, right? Well, here's sort of a puzzle. We can ask, does the barber shave himself? Right, so far we've considered these characters who we sort of specified, right, or we've assumed they're not the barber, but we can ask about the barber himself, right? Does the barber shave himself? So I've introduced this as a sort of puzzle. So you can tell perhaps already that something sort of fishy is going on here, right? And again, the lecture is called the Barber Paradox. Right? So there's something sort of strange here. But sort of think through this for a moment. Does the barber shave himself? So this might be a good time to pause the video, right? If you wanna think through this. All right. Well, here's one way to sort of think through it. Or maybe this is what you did, or maybe it's not what you did. But let's sort of go through it together. So does the barber shave himself? Well, there are sort of two possibilities, right? Or exactly two possibilities, right? So either the barber does shave himself, or the barber doesn't shave himself, right? There's no sort of third option. It's not that he sort of does, sort of doesn't, right? Either the barber does shave himself, or the barber doesn't shave himself. Okay, so what we're going to do now is think through these possibilities, right? So the first possibility is that the barber does shave himself. The second is that he doesn't shave himself, right? And we're going to ask what follows from each possibility. So let's consider each possibility in turn. Does the barber shave himself? Let's start with the supposition that the barber does shave himself. Right? So the barber shaves himself. What would follow from this? Well, remember our question is, does the barber shave himself? Okay, let's suppose that the barber does shave himself. We know that the barber shaves all and only those who do not shave themselves. So if the barber shaves himself, then the barber doesn't shave himself. What? Okay. So how is this supposed to work? Well, think back to the story, or look back at the story, right? If the barber shaves himself, I say, then the barber doesn't shave himself. Right, so we know that no one else, other than those people who shave themselves, is shaved by the barber. So if the barber is someone who shaves himself, well, what's supposed to happen? Well, I say that the barber doesn't shave himself then. Now, how's this supposed to work? So think through it for a minute. Okay, so we know that the barber shaves all and only those who do not shave themselves. Right, so that means for any person, right, who shaves himself, the barber doesn't shave him. Well, the barber is a person, and the barber shaves himself, so it should follow that the barber doesn't shave himself. Okay, that's really weird, right? So on the supposition that the barber shaves himself, the barber doesn't shave himself. That's to say the barber both shaves himself and doesn't shave himself if the barber shaves himself. Okay, but no one can both shave and not shave themselves. Right? The world's not like that. Right? That's what we call a contradiction. Right? So what's important here is that the barber shaves all and only those who do not shave themselves. Right? So if the barber shaves himself, right, then we know that the barber doesn't shave himself because the barber shaves only those who do not shave themselves. Right, so if the barber shaves himself, and since he shaves only those who do not shave themselves, the barber does shave himself. Okay, so this is like really weird, right? So let's be clear about what's happening here, right? We're not arguing that it is the case that the barber both shaves and doesn't shave himself, right? We're saying that if the barber shaves himself, right, then the barber does not shave himself, right? This is a conditional claim, right? We're not claiming that the antecedent, the part that follows the if and is before the then, actually happens, right? We're saying that if it were to happen, right, then the barber would both shave and not shave himself, right? So we're not saying that the barber does in fact shave himself and not shave himself. Okay, so we've looked at one possibility, right? If the barber shaves himself, then he doesn't shave himself. Let's look at the other possibility. Suppose the barber does not shave himself, right? Does the barber shave himself in this case? Right, so we know that the barber shaves all and only those who do not shave themselves. right? So it follows that if the barber doesn't shave himself, then he does shave himself, right? So anything, right, that doesn't shave himself, the barber shaves. Right? So the barber is something on this supposition that doesn't shave himself. So it would follow that the barber does shave himself. And again, we're not arguing that the barber both does and doesn't shave himself, right? We're saying that if the barber doesn't shave himself, then he does shave himself. Right? So he shaves all who don't shave themselves, and he's one of, well, all people. Okay, so let's sort of take a step back and think about what we've shown. We had this question, does the barber shave himself? Well, there are two possibilities. Either the barber does or he doesn't. And we showed that if he does, then he doesn't. And we've shown that if he doesn't, then he does. Curious. Okay, so here's the important point here. Either possibility results in a contradiction, right? So if he does shave himself, then he doesn't, right? That's to say, if he does, then he both does and doesn't, right? And if he doesn't, then he does, which is to say, if he doesn't, then he both does and doesn't. Okay? And these are what we call contradictions. So what's a contradiction? Well, it's a statement of the form P and not P, where P is just a proposition, right? So it's both snowing and not snowing, right? Or it's both Tuesday and it's not Tuesday. Or I'm both sitting and not sitting, right? What's important here is that contradictions are impossible, right? They can't possibly be true. There are no true contradictions. Every contradiction is necessarily false, right? So it's never the case that anyone is both sitting and not sitting, right? Or standing and not standing. It's never the case that it's both Tuesday and not Tuesday in the same place at the same time, right? The world just isn't like that. There are no true contradictions. Okay, so let's go back to our short story. Right? Does the barber shave himself? We said that there were two possibilities. Either the barber does or he doesn't. We showed that on the supposition that he does shave himself, that he doesn't shave himself. And we showed that on the supposition that he doesn't shave himself, then he does shave himself. Right? And we noted that either possibility results in a contradiction. On the first possibility, the barber both does and doesn't shave himself. And similarly on the second, the barber both doesn't and does shave himself. Right? So we have these statements of the form P and not P on the supposition that he does and that he doesn't. Right? On the supposition that he does, then here's our statement of the form P and not P. The barber shaves himself and the barber doesn't shave himself. On the supposition that he doesn't, our second supposition, right? The statement of the form P and not P is he both doesn't and he does shave himself. Right? So these are contradictions. Okay, so question. Can there be such a barber in a town as the one described in the short story? So think about it. If there were such a town and such a barber, then that barber would both shave and not shave himself. Why? Well, on this, we said that there were two possibilities. Right? Either the barber does shave himself or he doesn't. And we've shown that on the supposition the barber does shave himself, rather, that he both does and doesn't. And we've shown on the possibility that he doesn't shave himself, that he both does and doesn't. Right? So we had two options. The first option leads to contradiction, and the second option leads to a contradiction. Right? So it either has to be the case that the barber does shave himself or that he doesn't. Right? On the supposition that he does shave himself, he both does and doesn't. And on the supposition that he doesn't, he both does and doesn't. Okay, so can there be such a barber as the one described? Well, the answer is no. Why is that? Well, we said that there were two possibilities. Either the barber does or he doesn't. The first possibility leads to a contradiction, and so does the second. And we said that there were no true contradictions. Right? So if there were a barber in a town like the one described, the barber would shave himself and not. Do people see this? Right? If the barber does shave himself, then he doesn't. And if he doesn't shave himself, then he does. No true contradictions. Those are our only possibilities. Right? So there can be no such barber in town as the one described. Right, so here's the sort of point written out right here at the bottom. So if there were such a barber in a town as the one described, then there'd be a true contradiction. In either possibility, the barber would shave would shave himself and not shave himself. There aren't any true contradictions, so there can be no such barber in town as the one described. So one more time. If there were a barber in a town as the one described, then there would be a true contradiction. In either possibility, the barber would both shave himself and not shave himself. Okay, so if there were such a barber in a town, there'd have to be a true contradiction. But there are no true contradictions. So there can be no such barber as the one described. Okay, so here's the argument that we just gave. And I've put it in premise conclusion form. So we start off with our first premise. Suppose that there's a barber who shaves all and only those people who do not shave themselves. So this first premise is just a supposition, right? We're saying, suppose that there were a barber like this. Our second premise is that if the barber shaves himself, then he doesn't shave himself, right? And we gave the reasoning for that above. Okay. And our third premise is that if the barber doesn't shave himself, then he does shave himself. Okay. So on either possibility, we'd have a contradiction. So we can conclude that there's no barber who shaves all and only those people who do not shave themselves, which is to say that P1, our first premise, is false. Okay, so what have we done here? Well, we started with a supposition, something that we assume for the sake of argument, and then we've shown that that assumption leads to a contradiction. That's what we did in P2 and P3. Right? And then we conclude that our supposition, or the thing that we assumed, is false. Right? It can't possibly be true because it leads to a contradiction. Okay, so more carefully, or another time rather. So here's our assumption. We'll call this our reductio assumption, or assumption for reductio ad absurdum. Right? So we're going to assume this to show that its opposite is true, right? By showing that the assumption leads to a contradiction. Okay, so suppose that there's a barber who shaves all and only those people who do not shave themselves. This is our reductio assumption, or assumption for reductio. Okay, we consider our first possibility. If the barber shaves himself, well, we've argued that it follows that he doesn't shave himself. Similarly, in our third premise, on the assumption that the barber doesn't shave himself, we've shown that he does shave himself. Right, so now we have our conclusion, right, which is rejection of the first premise. There's no barber who shaves all and only those people who do not shave themselves. Okay, so we started with our reductio assumption, P1. We've shown in P2 and P3 that it leads to contradiction. And then in our conclusion, we reject the assumption, our reductio assumption, P1. Right, note that C is the opposite of P1, or the negation of P1. Okay, so here's the big idea, right? In this argument, we show that that an assumption, P1, a reductio assumption, leads to an absurdity, that is, a contradiction. On that basis, we reject the assumption.